Welcome to Maurer Glass Podcast. Today we're talking about how new media has changed our culture. Okay, so when I was younger and I would go to the movies and we would wait on a new film, which we called a film because it was a film. There was an actual film. I remember even going to the movie theater and getting excited because I knew there were new movies coming in because there were these giant cans, like literally, I'm talking about the size of a wheel on your car, of a tire on your car. And there would be 2 or 3 of them just sitting there and you knew new movies were coming into town. And now pretty much anybody can create video and does create video at home with a phone.
Yeah, they're already, when I went through film school, you could take classes on dealing with film as a traditional medium, clipping it together, cutting it, actually taping it and stuff like that. But they're already starting to not get rid of it, but it's sort of an extracurricular activity because you can live your entire filmmaking career now without ever touching film at all.
Right. So the term cut and paste actually comes from cutting and pasting. And not only film, but even when we wrote, when we used a typewriter and we wrote out papers, we would literally cut and paste. That would be how we would edit and figure out what we were doing. So
I think I was telling you that guy, he showed his son a floppy disk and the kid said, "Oh wow, you 3D printed the save icon." And
yeah.
He had no idea what that was.
Yeah, that's what he did.
I kind of remember. I remember floppy disks. They were still being used when I was a kid, but by the time I was in high school, you didn't use a
right.
floppy disk.
And so we would call them floppy. So the 5 1/4 was a floppy disk because literally it flopped. And then it came out, it was a 3.5 inch disk, which by the way was a square. So it is not so odd for me to have called that other thing a disk.
Oh, right.
By the way.
Right.
But
she was commenting on the SanDisk, the SD card in the audio
what?
recorder.
The what?
The SD card.
The what?
The SanDisk card.
Disc? Did you just say,
When I think disc, I think a round, circular, spinning object.
I asked him if the disc was in there, and he reprimanded me and said it wasn't a disc, it was square. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard him refer to it as a SanDisk.
Right. The brand is SanDisk. It's not an actual disc.
Well, I was still sort of right.
Okay, I'll give you a draw. You get a draw on that one.
Okay, so, and, back in the day, there were only a certain number of companies making films, and it was just a handful of companies because it was a big thing to do. It was a huge production. Film was basically only made in Hollywood, all over the world, not just in the U.S. I mean, it's why the U.S. dominated the film industry and really created it. It was literally a big production. It was such a big production that only a handful of people could do it. Only a few movies came out every year. And so what we saw and the lens through which we saw it was all created by a very few number of, very, very few people.
Yeah, little known fact, the term blockbuster, which was used by the, obviously the video rental company I think there's still one left, but it's not around anymore. The original usage of that word, it came from a production company wouldn't make one film every season. They would make 12, knowing that most of them would flop. And whichever one of their films actually did the best would break the block of films. Hence, that was known as the blockbuster.
So today, slowly things changed as there would be more and more independent filmmakers, and a lot of that had to do with the technology. Just the fact that the equipment was cheaper and cheaper to make it. And so you started seeing more independent films. Like, I don't even remember when I was young, even that there was a term, independent film or indie film. It just didn't happen. And then now, today, we've reached a point where, almost everybody under the age of something, maybe 25 or 30, can edit film. And so, or edit video. And YouTube has taken off. So many people can film whenever and wherever they want. And now what happens is you can pick what you want to see. Anybody can talk about anything, and then you also get to pick anything that you want to see. And that is just something that in my youth we never would have imagined possible. Not only was film limited, there were 4 channels on your television set. There was ABC, CBS, NBC, and then PBS, and that was literally all. So at any one point, there were 4 things running on your television. And by the way, also not even 24 hours a day. The TV channel turned off at a certain point. Now...
You can turn on the news at 3 a.m. and you will find news.
You will find news, and not only that, but you can look at it online and see what was said earlier in the day.
So how often would you go to the movies when you were a kid? Would it be like once every week, or?
For me, it was... So I grew up on military bases, and one of the things that they did, and probably still do on military bases, is make certain entertainment as inexpensive as they could. They were not trying to make money on the theater, on the military base, and everybody is on the military base and has a good living, but not necessarily a lot of money. And so it was something that we could do for a very good price. So even when I was young, you could go see a movie for, it was maybe 25 cents at a time when a movie theater ticket was probably $1.50 or $2. So I was able to go to the movies about once a week, and they usually, on Saturdays, I think they usually played something suitable for children. I would imagine that a lot of people my age did not go to the theater quite that often. There's another concept too. I was about 9 years old before I ever went to an indoor movie theater. That is not the way that I saw movies in the beginning.
Oh, you went to drive-thrus, I suppose?
It's not a...
Or drive-in.
Yes.
There's no...
We didn't even have drive-thrus.
You could drive through if you want, but you're going to miss the movie.
Right. So it would be a drive-in, and what you did was you pulled your car in, and usually they were almost always a double feature. Pulled the car in for us was a station wagon. There was no such thing as seat belts. There would be the way back is what we called it. And usually there was a double feature, and the first one would be more suitable for children. And we'd pull in, and you'd put this big... You'd hook this big thing on your car window, and that would be the sound. And you could get out of your car and walk over and get some food. And there was always a playground right in front, just under the movie screen. And that's what we would do. We'd all watch the first movie, and then after the first movie, my sister and I would be tired, and we'd sleep in the sleeping bags on the way back, and my parents would watch the next movie, and then we'd just wake up in our beds. I don't know how that happened.
Magic.
Right.
Parental magic.
Yeah.
Well, I went to a drive-thru one.
It's not a drive-thru.
Oh my God. I went to the drive-up movie.
In.
I went to a place where there was a movie playing outside, and I was in my car, and it was strange, and it was, there's still a few of them here in North Carolina.
The sound wasn't so great, but it was just a different type of experience, and it's the way that we experienced a lot of movies. And I can remember the first time going to a theater, and I thought it was a joke. I'm like, yeah, we're going to the movies, because we got out, and I didn't understand that.
Yeah, the filmmaker in me actually hated it the first time I went there. I went there, and I remember just being so distracted by other cars and people walking by and stuff like that I couldn't get removed. It's not like a dark room where you're just you just disappear. And so it's a fun thing. It's not something I would have done to go see a movie I was super excited for. So whenever I saw movies there would be like reruns of movies I had seen already.
Right. Well, back in the day, that might have been your only choice, depending on where you lived. And it also meant that you watched a movie at night and only at night, because you had to wait for it to get to be dark enough.
Right.
What happened was, whenever they made a movie, they wanted it to be something that appealed to a lot of people. Whereas today, with people making not only movies and stories, but just videos on YouTube, you can literally make video about anything and find video about anything. So,
and that's the awesome thing, is that even though there are more people doing it now, there's always been two sort of film worlds since like the birth of cinema. It's been the mainstream, which is what you're describing, the big production companies who come out with movies. There was always an indie scene underneath, but it wasn't mainstream. It wasn't until about the 90s with crossover hits like Quentin Tarantino that would make independent films that were weird, off the beaten path popular, and thanks to things like film festivals, there was now a place to see them. And the internet has sort of allowed the independent market to sort of now take over, where production companies are, they're making their couple of huge superhero movies, and they're making these huge things that people are expecting. But other than that, they're allowing independent filmmakers to just make films, and then they're just paying for the distribution of it because people want to see different stuff now. Right.
Well, not only was that going on in the 90s, but the other thing that was happening in the 90s was that there were places like Blockbuster, and you could go rent a VHS tape. And so a movie had more of a life beyond just being in the theater and then being on television. So you could make movies with the idea that they may only be on video.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw that with, the thing that comes to mind, just because I had children in the 90s, was children's movies. So, you might get their big blockbuster, like say Pocahontas or something like that. But they would do the spin-offs, Pocahontas 2, whatever
The direct-to-video never was in theaters, yeah.
Right.
The famous cassette tapes, yeah.
That's also when people started making film at home. So when I was younger, we had these Super 8s, and my dad would take film of us. But that was really rare. I didn't know anybody other than my dad who had that, and I'm not even sure why he did, because he wasn't particularly a nerd, but he did have it. But then we went to where, it was still pretty big, these cameras with the VHS, but I hoisted one on my shoulder and took what we now call video, but film of my children that way. And we weren't really good at editing them and all of that, but we have it. We've got that on
That's an interesting concept I've always been obsessed with, because until the age of about 7 or 8, I actually thought everything that happened prior to 1970 was in black and white, because that's all you ever saw. But you see that with films where they're like, especially the ones that are historical pieces, like if it's about like Nixon or if it's about an older president, they'll purposely color grade the film to look as if it were somehow like an excerpt from actual footage you had seen. So what's interesting is that if you were to do a period piece about the 90s, you might use that sort of VHS grainy look for it. But now in the in the early 2000s and now, everything's in HD and 4K. So when you do a period piece in 2050 now, you don't really have any sort of stylistic color grading other than, it's completely HD and you can see all of it. So that's an interesting like style. I don't know if I'd call it a handicap, but of course the quality of video by 2050 may be so good that what we're seeing now, it will look stylized compared to the future. I
think by 2050 it will be, where you're saying color is so different from black and white, I do think it's going to be three-dimensional. Mm-hmm. I don't think I think the idea of sitting down and looking at a flat plane and watching a story go by is going to seem very antiquated. Mm-hmm. I think that it will be...
I'll tell you, it's a huge debate going on in just the behind-the-scenes indie, or just film industry in general. One of the biggest opponents to that theory is Christopher Nolan, who argues that film has always been a three-dimensional art. And so by making it literally three-dimensional, there is some skill and craft you're losing. Whereas you have people like James Cameron who are saying that by adding in a whole nother dimension, you're allowing filmmakers to have a whole nother set of tools and style techniques. Because one thing he and a couple of other filmmakers have brought up is that not only are filmmakers getting smarter and better and more crafty with what they're doing, people who watch movies are doing the same. Like one of the most famous historical events, and some of this is myth, but it's a good point, is there was this film that came out in the early 1900s, and it was called it's called something like A Train, live view on the train tracks, or it's basically a film that was during the cinema of attractions phase, when it was just shock value. Edison electrocuted an elephant for 30 seconds, and that was the whole film, and you paid money to go see that. It was the cinema of attractions. We were talking about the Three Stooges the other day. That sort of physical humor, just physical, like this is it. That's all you had to do to entertain people, because it was still a new medium. And so what ends up happening is consumers get smarter. I mean, Spielberg once said that what's interesting is that you can't scare people with film the way you used to, because they've seen stuff. So you have to get better at stuff because consumers are getting better. So what James Cameron and these other filmmakers are saying is that as viewers are getting smarter, we have to find new ways to entertain them. And one of those ways is three-dimensional. So it's interesting on both sides.
The other way is interactive. So the most interactive that you saw when I was younger was very creative when a movie came out and it had, 3 alternative endings and you weren't sure which ending you were going to see. But or sometimes they'd show them all. But now, I think as we go in the future, film can be more interactive. And so the idea of entertainment as far as watching a movie and playing a game may kind of mix, where you are sort of a part of the whole experience. Yes, I am talking about the holodeck on Star Trek.
That's a Star Trek thing, isn't
Yes.
it? Okay.
It is a Star Trek.
Casually slide. Let me do my checklist and casual Star Trek reference. Check. Yeah, I've thought about that a lot when I was a kid. There was this one time we went to go see a movie. It was a movie that took place in the desert. It was either one of the newer Mad Maxes or it was something like that. And I was like thirsty the entire movie. And I remember halfway through the movie, my mom, looked over and said, "Do you want something to drink?" I was like, "No, I'm actually fine. There's some reason that I like this." And what I liked about it was I was watching a desert scene and I was thirsty. I was somehow in that world. And then later in high school, I saw a movie where it was cold and I had the thought, I was like, what would be cool if you made a movie that took place on Mount Everest or somewhere like that, and you purposely told the movie theater to make it like 5 to 10 degrees colder in the movie theater, like as part of the experience. So I think 3D can come in other ways other than visual too. Like I hope they start playing with that a lot more, and some are with like 3-dimensional chairs that vibrate and stuff like that. The
other kind of mystery right now is there even going to be a reason for a movie theater? Video is so distributed now, and I can sit in my pajamas and put my computer on my lap or even watch my television and have it play for me whatever I want to watch, whether it be a specific kind of recipe I can get as specific as I want. I can watch whatever I want. So, and it can be entertaining or it can be educational. And so there is going to have to be, either theaters will go away entirely or there will have to be some experience that they're offering that I can't get at home. And that is going to have to go beyond just being a big screen.
And that was the appeal of VHS originally, was you could finally bring the movie theater at home. And that's another debate that's going on right now, is that some filmmakers, again like Chris Nolan, are specifically designing their films to have like sound mixes that you can't possibly recreate in your house. His latest film, Dunkirk, is a war film, and they mixed it in a way where it would sound great in a giant room and really get you in the middle of the action and really feel the stress of what these soldiers were going through. And again with the children, but the other thing about that is, if you do want to stop and go get a drink, you just stop it and you go get a drink. Yeah. So there are advantages to that too, where you can, and also for anybody who's ever had a child, and in your case, who's been a child in the age of having these videos at home, some children want to watch the same movie 8,326 times. So, there's that too. I had 3 or 4 VHS tapes that I would pop in as I was going to sleep. And I never made it more than 10 minutes into these movies, but it was just sort of a thing I did, yeah. And it's not just film, it's television too, where we went from having those 4 channels to having a lot of channels, and you could get more specific. There were things like HGTV and the Food Network and DIY things, and I'm sure other stuff I didn't pay any attention to that were more, for other people like my dad, it would be sort of the History Channel and, I don't know, war stuff. And so you really, you could get much more specific about what you were watching, to Netflix and YouTube and all of that. We're now on Netflix, not only can I, for me, it's exciting because not only can I watch new shows and just watch them one right after the other the way that I want to watch them, but I can go back and see some of the shows that I saw back in the day and watch them all in order. Because some of the shows that I saw back in the day, I didn't necessarily watch all in order. Because if you miss a week, you miss the week. And you'd have to wait for a rerun to catch up. And again, for me, it's Star Trek. It was nice to be able to go back and see each one in order. And occasionally, as much as I thought I had seen every single episode, I go, whoa, I don't think I saw that episode. I don't know how that happened. Yeah. In my generation, we grew up, as satellite TV was adding like thousands of channels. Like you were mentioning 3 or 4 channels, we had thousands. And sometimes, one thing I think it did for us was I think it cultivated this idea of, you guys call them reruns, but for us that was regular viewing. You would have 2 Nickelodeon channels. One was on Eastern Standard Time, one was on Western Time. And what they were playing was the same episodes of the same shows we all loved, but replaying them. Like there's this episode, there's that episode, and every Friday and Saturday they would come out with like a new episode to add to that batch. But we were kind of cultivated to just, you watch all of these episodes from all of these seasons at once. We didn't book our schedule by, here's the new episode. We were grown to sort of appreciate an entire series in its entirety. No, it was a different thing where we knew that our family had certain shows that we watched, and so
it wasn't a lot. We didn't sit in front of the TV all day, but there were certain nights we knew what we were watching. And I remember, Sunday we'd watch the Wide World of, it was the Wonderful World of Disney or something. And so we'd be all prepared. We'd all be together. We'd have the popcorn done, or, we'd schedule dinner around it, and it was an event, and we would all do it together. One thing that happened kind of in between this sort of 4 channels thing and the Netflix and the YouTube thing is, when you were talking about going to 1,000 channels, we started with about, sort of 20, then 50, and then hundreds, and then whatever. And I remember when it was still sort of 50, really a lot of channels, we would all joke that, we would sit down and we'd flip through all 50 and yep, there was nothing on. The difference was that now by the time we got through and determined it was nothing on, well, 30 minutes had gone by, so we got to do it again. Mm-hmm. There was more there, but you weren't really doing it. You still really weren't deciding what to watch. Mm-hmm. You had more options, but you weren't really deciding. And with Netflix now, you really watch what you want when and it's not just Netflix, it's Hulu and Amazon and all of those, but you really are watching what you want when you want it. Mm-hmm. And, as they say, binge watching. And for me, a lot of times I prefer that. If I know that a certain series, like I just watched Alias Grace, for example, and I knew there were so many episodes, and that's what I was going to watch until I was done with that. Mm-hmm. Even though it maybe took several days, it's still...
Yeah, something I hear frequently and I say is, someone will say, oh, I just watched this show. The first question out of the person's mouth now is, how many seasons are out? Right. It's not, when's the next episode? It's if the season doesn't have every episode, I personally wait. And it's not even because I want to watch all of it in the first day. I do that. It's just, if I want to, I want the option. I absolutely hate not being able to finish something.
Yeah. The back in the day, too, what time slot a show had a lot to do with whether it would be successful. They jockeyed and vied for those time slots. And now that doesn't matter. It is purely whether people want to see what you've put out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about movie theaters, because you mentioned earlier whether or not they're going to be around for a while. And there's several problems with movie theaters right now that they know and that most people know, and I think it's something they're going to have to fix, because as the internet is changing how we're consuming media, it's going to be fun to see how they finally figure out they're either going to have to change or they're going to be gone.
Right. So people now get all upset sometimes when something's going to go away and it can't go away. And why? Find a drive-in theater. Mm-hmm. You
mean like a new release that is no longer in the theater, or?
No, what I'm saying is, I'm not married to theaters staying, and I'm not married to them going away.
Oh, I see.
Whereas some people, they grip on and they go, oh, we have to have them. No, we don't. If they still make sense for us, we will have them. And if they don't, they won't, and we'll move on. And I guess I've seen that enough not to be worried about it.
Yeah. The main 3 problems that most people cite is, number 1 are the overpriced concessions. And where that comes from is that for a while, production companies would make movies and then they would release the movies in their own theater. So Paramount would make 10 movies and then they would release them in a Paramount theater. Then sometime in the 40s, the Supreme Court, the U.S. justice system said you cannot make the movies and distribute them. You can't. You have there's too much vertical control going on here. So you either make the movies or you distribute them. So enters in third-party theaters. So you have like Regal, Carmike, those kind of things. They make virtually no money on the actual movie. So they make all of their money to keep just the place running off of concessions, which leads to the overpriced concessions.
So this thing you said where the court said you can't make a movie and distribute it because basically then you have a monopoly. Now, I think they're saying because you have a monopoly. So it's different from a doctor, a physician cannot have any shares in a pharmacy, because you cannot prescribe drugs and sell drugs. And that is not about having a monopoly. That's about a conflict of interest. I think in this case, you're saying that it's about a monopoly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now the world has changed. And a lot of people can make movies and a lot of people can distribute movies, right? So Netflix does that. They make films and they distribute it. So what is your thoughts on that now? I mean, should that just be overturned? Is that an antiquated law?
They need to get on the same page for certain, because yeah, like you said, Netflix makes its own stuff and distribute. The original reason the court decided that you cannot make movies and distribute them was they said, number one, it would make prices non-competitive. It would boost prices. Well, if the concession prices are super expensive because the movie theater is just trying to survive, that is the inflation of a price. If Paramount is controlling its own distribution channel, it can sell dollar popcorn. So in a way, it sort of did the very thing that it was trying to avoid. The second thing is that they said was that they're allowing themselves to boost their own movies. So back then, they would have their tentpole films, the ones they expected to do well. Then they would have their 9 or 10 B movies. But there was no real place for indie filmmakers. They could choose which movies would get screen time. They recognized that having your movie, being able to control what movies are seen, even controlling what time of night that the movie is controlled or that the movie is screened, gives you an advantage. And so this was before the internet. Netflix can do the same thing. How many times have you been onto Netflix and you see all these other movies made by people, but a Netflix original series has a huge poster at the top of the screen? That is the exact same as a physical movie theater putting their movie poster above another indie artist. So I think they need to get on the same page, and what I think that means is they need to overturn that.
I agree. I do agree, because now anybody can make film and anybody can distribute it, really.
Right. And in order to make the experience better, they have to bring down prices they need to make the experience of going to the movies less about, oh my God, to just go out to the movies, it costs like $50. You know, if it was a cheaper experience, I think I was telling you, this one movie theater is already starting to do a subscription thing where every month you pay an amount and you get to see one movie a week. I mean, that's already sort of leaning in the right direction.
Well, there's an indie theater group here that you pay one price for the year and you can see as many movies as you want.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Just, yeah, I mean, and the price is something like, I mean, I may be off a little bit, but it's something like $250 for the year, and then that's for 2 people. Mm-hmm. 2 people can see as many movies as they want for the year. Now, the indie theaters aren't playing as many movies, but they're still playing quite a few. And because they're a group, you know, it's multiple theaters, each playing 1 to 2 films. So, you know, it is more economical. For me, I think, for the most part, would rather be at home. You're more of a movie geek than I am. So I do
both. See, I've never subscribed personally to the notion of we want this to die and we move to the new thing. It's always layered. I mean, there are still people watching VHS tapes. There are still people who go to the theaters, and there are people that go to the theaters that also watch Netflix. What I think it's like is more of a pyramid. Everyone's got 4 or 5 pieces of art, whether that's a musician they like, a film director they like, or a singer who's coming out with an album or something like that. Everyone's got things that they are waiting for that comes out once every now and then. And then underneath that is like, here's shows that I really enjoy. Here's a series that when there's a new season, I'll watch it. And then below that's, you know, like YouTube videos, like here's a song that I'll listen to randomly. I think it's layered. So I like movie theaters and I like Netflix, and I don't think they necessarily one has to die for the other to survive. I think they both need to evolve as time changes, but...
One small thing that was sort of surprising to me was as we got more channels, one of the channels we got was a channel called MTV. And at the time, MTV didn't even have any advertisements. It was. I know MTV is very different now, but what they did was they played music videos, and that's all they did. And for us, it changed music, because it added a dimension to it of now there was this film art that went with the song, and a good music video could make a band. Like it really could change the world for, you know, it changed the world a lot in the way of music. And then when my children were younger, it's stunning to me that they didn't care about music videos at all. Like they still do make them, but it didn't progress as something that was important in the culture. It certainly was in the 80s. I don't know how much it was in the 90s. I don't think a lot. And then by 2000 for sure.
Yeah. Well, and that's the interesting thing, is that was an advertisement. It was a 24/7 advertisement for the band. So, for instance, MTV is owned by Viacom. Viacom itself owns several record-producing studios. So, if they had a new band that they were really trying to push, they suddenly controlled the distribution for advertising them. It's the exact same thing. And for some reason, despite all of these other industries having that exact same freedom of controlling their own distribution, YouTube, Netflix, film is the one place where suddenly if Warner Brothers wants to have a Warner Brothers theater, they're not allowed to. And I really think it would be better for everybody if they could. They should be allowed to, I think.
Yeah, it just sounds like, it does sound like the law is antiquated to me, and maybe if somebody were to challenge it, it would change. Disney strikes me as a company that would challenge it.
Probably, and that's the other thing, is what they were trying to stop was media companies having too much control. But in all honesty, right now there are only 5 or 6 media companies. Everything we think is diversified is owned by 6 media companies. It's all Disney, Viacom, these companies that own everything. So they didn't stop a monopoly from it. Whether or not it is a monopoly and there should be more companies is a whole another discussion. But
right.
The only thing it's doing is hurting consumers by making movie theaters less accessible. And as someone who likes movie theaters and wants that experience to survive any way it can, I'd like to see, I wouldn't mind a Warner Brothers theater. I think it would be great.
I don't mean to be callous. I'm not married to whether movie theaters survive. If they make sense, then they make sense. If they don't, then they don't. I mean, the downside to movie theaters is not only the expense, but it's that you have to watch it at a particular time. Now you have to, when you go in, you're inundated with 30 minutes of advertising. And not only now is it watching the trailers for other movies, but it's straight up, drink this soda, or I don't go that often, and it's not just the expense, it's that you have to go at a specific time. Now at least we can reserve the seat, which is good. They're not necessarily particularly clean. The food is expensive, but not only is it expensive, it's unhealthy and it's bad. I don't normally have the food there. You're inundated with 30, sometimes 40 minutes of advertising beforehand. And it isn't just trailers for other movies, which I actually enjoy seeing, but it's, drink this soda or...
Yeah, it's layered, and it's because of, it's a third-party movie theater where the first batch of things you see are advertisements that are supporting the theater, and then the official quote-unquote production starts, and then the trailers that are tied to the actual production company play. So it's all of these extra layers of advertisements specifically because of this system.
And then not only that, you have people next to you who are talking, or they're on their phone, or they're texting, or they're doing all kinds of stuff, and it's just not...
AMC is doing a really good job. Their theaters they're the ones who have sort of designed these huge, large seats. They have you reserve your seat so that you have it. And generally speaking, because the AMC theaters are so nice and it's so such a professional tier of movie watching, that the crowds are typically quieter.
We did. I went to one recently, and we do have one near me, and those are nice. I went to one recently, and there were people in our seats.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so I told them, and they said, oh, and they moved down. And then about 20 minutes into the movie, some guy with a flashlight comes and hauls their butts out of there.
You know why it's another factor? You know why it's called a trailer? You
No.
might actually.
No.
No? Okay. So it's called a trailer because they used to come after the film. They would trail the film.
Okay.
And they discovered something, according to them, surprising, that people once
stay.
they're done with the movie, they want to leave.
Right. I didn't even call it a trailer for a number of years. I was an adult before I even heard that term. We called it previews. Mm-hmm. The previews. Are you going to be there for the preview? Or
Yeah,
one
the
of the
previews.
previews?
Yeah, people still they'll call it that. It's just when you see the green thing and it'll say this trailer has been rated, et cetera, this preview. It's used interchangeably now.
I can tell you this too. The previews when the Disney films came out and on VHS, of course you'd watch the previews the first time you were watching the movie, but then you'd fast forward through them and what Disney tried, and I'm sure other people did too, was when they did it on DVD, they made it so you couldn't fast forward, you couldn't skip, you couldn't, and that was so irritating because it's one thing to watch it once, but when you're going to watch Beauty and the Beast literally 300 times, oh no, don't make me go through those previews. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've got 3-year-olds demanding this movie, it's just,
Right.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Maurer Glass Podcast. You can get all of the episodes on maurerglass.com. That's MAURER glass.com.